Thank you very much everyone for coming along and joining this virtual event. And this is strategic planning for smaller single academy trusts. During the event, we'll hear from an NSN Specialist and Academy Ambassador, Regional Advisor, as well as panel members on topics such as planning for growth, setting your risk appetite, and increasing autonomy as the trust grows. In terms of the format of this event, just before I go into some introductions, we'll be listening to a presentation followed by panel discussion. Then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions to the panel yourselves, as well as an opportunity to network with other attendees at the end of the session. Just a little bit of housekeeping during the session, please do keep your microphones muted, and also advisable to turn cameras off if internet struggles, just to secure that bandwidth. Please do put questions in the chat throughout the presentation as well, and really important to reference which specific panel member you might be sort of directing that question to, if not a general question to the panel, just that we know whose points you're building on there. And last but not least, we are recording the session as well, so just to make you aware that that recording will be available following the event. So just to introduce our panel members, first of all, I'm really pleased to welcome New Schools Network Specialist and Academy Ambassador, Regional Advisor, Anne Casey, who'll be exploring strategic planning and trust growth for small and single academy trusts with you today. And she'll also be joined on the panel by Sarah Counter. Sarah's the CEO, founder and director of Canary Wharf College Trust. Give a little wave there. And since opening up Canary Wharf College East Ferry in the first tranche of free schools all the way back in 2011, the trust have continued to expand steadily through the free school route. And the trust now supports 3 free schools, continually strategically thinking about the future. We've also got Stephen Munday, CBE. Stephen is the Chief Executive of the Cam Academy Trust, an 11-school trust based in Cambridgeshire, which supports both primary and secondary schools, pursuing growth through academy conversion, sponsorship, and the free school route. And the trust communicates its purpose through a simple statement, which is to secure academic excellence for all. We also have Phil Wheeliker. He's the Chair of Trustees for the South Pennine Academies Trust, a trust which prides itself on strong partnerships with families, local businesses and community agencies. Formed in 2012 by a single academy converter, the trust has grown steadily since 2015 with 2 primary free schools. The board have also considered a range of growth options, including conversions and sponsorship. And Chris Drake, last but certainly not least, he's the Chair of Orbis Education Trust, and the trust established in 2011 operated as a single academy trust at Southfield School until they were joined by Kingsthorpe College earlier this year. With recent experience of growth and a further free school in pre-opening, Chris can share many key reflections on the process, past and present. So with introductions over and done with, without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Anne, who will kick us off with a presentation.
Thank you very much, Tim. Good morning, everyone. It's really nice to see some very familiar names on the screen, and also welcome to everyone who I have not yet met. Graham, have we got the slides, please? Thank you very much. Okay, so next slide, please, Graham. I thought it was worth reflecting on what we know already, and that is that the government's vision is for every school to be part of a family of schools in strong academic trusts. If I can just bring up the graphic on that screen, please, Graham. Just go back one, please. Okay, it's not coming up. Never mind. Tech lets us down. I just wanted to reference the fact that the DFE have brought out research today. I'll send it to you as a link following the event, but it's the school's views and the perceived benefits and obstacles to joining a multi-academy trust. It's quite timely that it's been published this morning, and many of the aspects of that research will be discussed today. So what we do know is that over 50% of pupils in state-funded education study in academies. As of August last year, 75% of sponsored primary and secondary academies that have been inspected are good or outstanding. And in the research, the vast majority of recent converters, that's 82% for primary and 74% for secondary, reported that the overall impact of joining a MAT has been positive. Most of these felt that the positive impact met or exceeded their expectations, and that's high, 92% primary, 86% secondary. And most schools said that increasing collaboration was a key reason for having joined a MAT, and approaching 9 in 10 described this as key or the most important reason. And the sharing of skills was widely reported as being really significant improvements with regard to sharing staff and skills. So it's a very in-depth report. I think if you are thinking about a growth journey, there's a lot of very useful reflections and data that is worth exploring. So next slide, please, Graham. So what we're going to explore today is planning for growth and also understanding how colleagues implemented the strategy, because without an implementation strategy, we just have hope. And all of the people on the panel have implemented a strategy effectively. Obviously, how you grow the central team and the optimum time to do that is something that will be of importance. Ensuring strong governance at every level of the trust. And having a strong scheme of delegation that works, and setting and managing the risk appetite is something I want to touch on. Next slide, please, Graham. So obviously, if you are looking at growth strategy, whether it's with local schools, whether it's sponsored academies or new free schools, the RSC and the SFA will consider these things. And 2/3 of primary schools and half of secondary schools have reported that the availability of support and guidance on the conversion process have been good. The reasons that they cite for joining a trust, no surprises here, but these are the top ones: to benefit from better strategic planning and direction, to provide more opportunities for staff for professional development, to gain access to better centrally provided services, to benefit from cost savings and efficiencies, and to benefit from strengthened governance and leadership, obviously all leading to improved pupil outcomes. So if I can I move on to the next slide, please? So one of the things that you might be thinking about is how your structure will change, and I'm sure colleagues will talk about this on the call today, where we've gone from having a head teacher who may become the chief exec, and then having to build the central team, including the CFO, and whether they are a chartered accountant from business. We're looking at considerable budgets, HR becoming increasingly an important function, and then below that, your school improvement team, your hub directors and heads of school. So that's just one model. There are many, and I'm sure we will discuss how people have approached this in their trusts. We now can stop the slides, please, Graham, and go straight into the panel discussion. Thank you very much. So one of the things I'm sure colleagues will be very interested to explore is why you decided to grow and who was involved in that discussion. Sarah, if I could come to you first, please.
Yes, certainly. Well, we grew in an area where there was a pupil placement need in Tower Hamlets at the time. There's massive growth in the area, and there were short of pupil places in the specific part of Tower Hamlets in which we were trying to put a school up. So it was in response to pupil placement need. Then when we opened, we had such an overwhelming desire from parents to join school. Our schools have consistently been 4 times oversubscribed per pupil place ever since we've opened. I couldn't bear turning these parents away in tears. So I then looked for another site in which to open another school. And the local authority were actually quite grateful that we did open the second site, although it was really difficult to do, but we did. And so that's how the growth started. And then we wanted to be able to have a secondary school in which the children to follow through that was of the same standard as our primaries. So we started that. So it sounds terribly obvious and terribly simple, but that was the reasoning behind actually growing.
Thank you, Sarah. Could I come to you, Chris, with the same question, please?
Yes, certainly. As you said in the introduction, we were a single academy trust until very recently. We wanted to grow because we were very happy with what we were doing, in fact, and we wanted to be able to keep on doing it. and we didn't feel that we would be able to operate the way we wanted to by ourselves for very much longer, for two reasons. One, the government taste for schools entering multi-academy trusts, and the other, that the single academy trust business model, if we use that expression, the way the finance works, is in our opinion, inefficient and not sustainable in the long term. It's too wasteful and doesn't take advantage of synergies. So we wanted to do these things. We had a look round at some large multi-academy trusts to see if there would be a place for us within them. But we do things, or historically have done things, a little bit differently. And we didn't see that we'll be allowed to carry on in the way we had in the past. So we decided to try and form a multi-academy trust ourselves. Through two routes: one, finding another academy or academies that would like to form a trust with us, and two, making an application for a new school within our local area. We now have a partner academy just about 18 miles away from us in Northampton, and about 3 miles away the new free school is being, or just about to start being, built. And we would certainly like to have another one as well. So we grew because we were happy and we wanted to stay as we were and do education our way.
Thank you, Chris. And your experience, Phil, of growth, which is a little bit different, I think.
Very different, I'm afraid. We started off as an outstanding single academy with a very well thought of chief executive. She was a member of the head teacher board and volunteered our services for any academies that required sponsoring. We very quickly took on, it was a secondary academy, and we took on a primary academy, which was in special measures. We turned it around, at which point our wonderful regional schools commissioner decided she could use us, and we sponsored several more academies over the next few years. At the point, we grew our reputation, we started to get converters, and then we opened 2 free schools as well. So we have grown through every possible means, and hopefully we'll continue to grow. I know which is the easiest, if that's
It'd be worth coming back to that, actually, Phil. Stephen, can you enlighten us on your growth journey in Cambridgeshire?
Yeah, sure, Anne, and welcome to everyone. And I think when I put this down, there were sort of 3 areas, and I think they've now just all been covered, which is great. One of them is because we believe in what we're doing, and there seems to be a level of interest and popularity about the education that we provide. We want excellence for all in our area, so why wouldn't we want to move on and do more of that? That's at the core of what we are. So I think if you want to say that's the most important thing. Without that driving, what's it all about anyway? That there are benefits to growth, and that's both sort of financial and organisational, but also educational, and being able to pull things together and run them appropriately can see all benefiting both any current schools in the trust and future schools. And the other point chimed in, I think, with what Phil was saying, that in truth, in practice, when I think about it, it's because usually people approached us, and that might be the regional school commissioner, that might be the local authority, or that might be individual schools, and all 3 of those sources have led to our growth in various different ways.
Great. I just want to pick up a point there, which I think would be interesting to our colleagues. The difference between setting up a free school and taking on a sponsored academy. Stephen, do you want to chip in on that one?
Yes. Okay. So, and I know Phil was going to comment on this as well, and I would very much agree. It's not the same. I think both are harder and easier depending on what way you look at it. What is most straight work, without a doubt, setting up a whole new school, and no one should underestimate. I'm sure all the contributors here certainly wouldn't underestimate, because they've done it. The sheer amount of hard work. It is loads of work. But in some ways it's easier, if that makes sense from my perspective. Sorry, others may have another, because you're drawing on a blank piece of paper, and it's up to you, and it's your fault. When you take on another school, of course, you take on everything that comes with that. The staff, the whole culture, which may have developed over decades. So it's it's quite significantly different, the job of work you might feel you have to do when you're growing from nothing, and appointing all the staff or moving across staff from pre-existing, compared to you take something that's pre-existing. And in our case, it's been, for example, schools on all 4 Ofsted grades have joined us as pre-existing organisations. In some ways, that's harder. It's not as much work, but it's not straightforward changing cultures and doesn't happen overnight. That would be my observation.
Thanks, Stephen. Phil, from a chair's perspective, what would be your view of the difference?
I tend to agree with everything Stephen's just said. Yeah, although there is an immense amount of work going behind a free school, the people doing it are operations, HR and finance. When you sponsor an academy, what you're doing is you're taking on a school that has problems, in which case your school improvement team are very much involved. And yeah, as Stephen said, that is the difficult part, because you're getting people to change their way of operating. With new employees in a free school, it's dead easy. You overlay your own procedures, policies, and they do it. When you have a sponsored academy, one of the things you have to do is convince the local advisory board, the local governors, that our way of doing things is better than your way of doing things. If it wasn't, why would you be doing it? That can be difficult. From a chair's point of view, yes, I spent a lot of time talking to local governors about the positive bits about joining us as a MAT. So I became a salesman.
Okay, I'm interested in, Chris, if I can come to you, about who, if you're thinking about growth and your growth strategy, who should be involved in that conversation?
Well, I suppose, having listened to the 2 things have been said already, so we talk about taking on an academy that's already in existence. You need the contact between the 2 chairs or 2 governing bodies to begin with. Salesman, I think, is a good expression. I had lots of cups of coffee with many different chairs of governors in our area before we managed to come to some arrangements. You need to be certain that your own head teacher or chief executive is keen on the project, and it's useful to have a lot of support from the head teacher of the other school as well. And then bringing the 2 governing bodies together to form conversations, build bridges, start explaining what you're doing. I think doubt and uncertainty and misinformation can be the enemy when you're trying to bring 2 establishments together. So actually, the more you meet and the more you know about each other and the more open you are, the better it is. But because if it's not a fit, you're better to find that out sooner rather than later.
Thank you. And Sarah, just reflecting on in your situation where there was a high demand, but that is not without risk. What was the dialogue between you as CEO and the board's function in managing the risk? How did that work to allow that growth to happen safely?
I think the board were mainly local from the area, and therefore they could see that the risk was fairly minimal, that we would, because of our high demand of places, we would be able to fill that second school without any difficulty. So I think managing the risk was more down to personnel and ensuring that as the principal of the first startup school, there was going to be enough capacity to be able to build that second school within the organisation that we had, because it does take an enormous amount of energy. And it's a big move when you are going from being a single entity to two schools, because you're not given any more money for quite a while to be able to build that capacity to be able to cope with 2 schools, and then same with 2 to 3 schools. And as we did ours in fairly quick succession, you've sort of got I was coping with a building project at one point and starting the second school, with a business case for the third school also coming in online at the same time. And whilst you sort of look fondly back at the pizza box days when there were just sort of 9 of you, and we're now nearly 200 on the staffing, you actually have to make that transition from being the social entrepreneur that's got a finger in every pie to one that actually is more bringing in staff, appointing staff, and transferring your skills onto them.
Lovely, thank you. And just reflecting on, you know, the ambition for growth, but making sure you get the right fit, Phil. When you are considering growth through conversion or sponsorship, how do you make sure that the school is going to fit the trust?
It's all down to your due diligence and the checks you do from my point of view. There are simple due diligence. What's the balance sheet look like? What do the reserves look like? You know, what is the budgetary control like? In some ways, that's very, very easy. But then, of course, you get the performance and you get the governance. And for me, as a chair, the biggest issue is always going to be governance. I have a chief executive and all her staff who can look after the learning and development side of things. But for me, it has to be, am I able to convert these people to our way of governance? We are obviously very proud of our levels of governance, and what we don't want to do is to dilute it. One of the questions I've often had is, from the chair of the local, the previous school's local governors, I want to join the board, and then I have to ensure, have you got the skills to join our board? Anne and I have had this conversation in the past that when we first converted, as I suspect with every single Academy Trust converter, we took the local governing board and made them trustees. That was fine for a short period of time. As we grew, it became very, very obvious very, very quickly that what had been the local governing board did not have the business skills to run a multi-academy trust, and lots of difficult conversations had to be had. We learned from that. We now include that as part of our due diligence, and we have that difficult conversation up front to let people know that we do have a strong board. They may or may not be able to join that board, but they will be expected to buy into our MAT governance. Yeah,
that's really helpful. Chris, I'm going to ask you the same question, but tie in a question from one of our colleagues, Stuart. How you mentioned that you were different, so we're curious about what the difference was, and then how you made sure that the new schools fit.
Okay, well, we fortunately have a very, very high energy and proactive executive head, or head teacher as she was at that point. We like to try things. We're very innovative. I've had lots of conversations over years on many different governing bodies which are safe because they never get put into action. We do things and we try things out. We changed the school days. We changed professional development so that it could be done in quote marks work time as opposed to what appears to be after school. We've taken a huge amount of notice of our outside areas. Coming into our grounds now looks a bit like entering a leisure facility. There's tables and chairs and umbrellas, cycling tracks, assault courses. Not that we call them that now. There's another name for them which I've forgotten. So we're trying to say everyone should get outside. We've got special mile-long walking tracks. Some of the teachers have their meetings walking around them now. So we wanted to get rid of pressure. We thought education should be enjoyable for the children. And for that to be the case, it has to be enjoyable for the staff, because clearly they are the biggest influencer on children. So we decided to take the pressure off. I'm definitely not anti-exams. If someone passes exams and gets good grades, they did that themselves, and that's wonderful, and they deserve it. But I think you can do that whilst having fun. So we took out some of the hard lessons that were there all the time, lesson after lesson after lesson, and put in what we called for a while noisy lessons, whether that was drama or art or drumming or dance or whatever it may be, to let the pressure off. And we thought, counterintuitively, we expected that would actually improve our exam results because the pressure would be taken away. If it hadn't worked, we could have stopped doing it, but the results were that good. If they'd gone down a little, we weren't overly concerned. But they got better as the place got happier and the tension released and people were outside more in a different atmosphere. Everything started coming together, and we didn't want to have to go back and be running a dry school. So yeah, we'd love to do well, but we like to enjoy it while we're doing it.
Thank you. And Stephen, anything in addition in terms of that fit for you and making sure it all works?
Yeah, a couple of quick points. I mean, I think in various ways articulated, we've got to be absolutely clear about what we're all about, and you know, for us, some clearly articulated principles. We say, what are we? We are these principles. If that is nothing like what your school might be like, then this isn't going to work. You know, I would say they're core fundamental educational values, and many people would want to buy in, but being clear about that. I would just put in one other thing though, and that is, you know, we've got quite a strong local view of what we're doing, and there would be, and it could lead to some interesting trust board discussions, there's a presumption that any school very locally we would want to receive into the trust. That becomes interesting when, as Phil says, you do the due diligence, and this looks shocking. So what do you do? Well, the answer is there's got to be a school there, and it's got to provide great education for the local community. Sadly, it's currently bust and probably not providing good education. So what do you do? And I think, you know, in those circumstances, we might have a presumption to say we've got to work out a way of doing this, even though we acknowledge this isn't straightforward. We'd probably then try and drive as hard a bargain with the RSC and any others as we possibly could. But having a view about particularly what we'd call our area might affect our view of due diligence and what we might or might not be prepared to try and do.
Thank you. And the research that was published today points to quite a lot of people finding the conversion process took a lot of time, a lot of hard work. What do you think, Sarah, are the critical changes and the legal implications that colleagues should be thinking about?
I think one of the critical changes is helping the board to understand that they've now got a bigger envelope of schools to care for, and therefore that transition as to how we're going to keep the stakeholder, the ear of the stakeholders available to the board. Because when you're small, the board has a huge understanding. I had a fantastic board who were very involved in the school right from day one. And they were there, not over involved, they were very good about standing back, but they were there ready to support, would always come to performances and things like that and help. And then when you get 2 schools and then 3 schools, you have to find a way of keeping that stakeholder involvement. So we had to set up the local college councils. Now I'm talking about 3 startup schools, obviously not converter schools. If we were going to be taking on a school that is already established, I think what Phil was saying is really key, that you have to have those conversations really early to help those boards understand that they're not necessarily going to come on to your board of trustees. We have a local college council for each of the 3 schools, and they're their stakeholder interest group. And one of the trustees will chair the local college council of each school, and they then feed back into the board of trustees. And we find that model works very well because our schools are so close. It's geographically, it's quite easy for us to have that stakeholder body, and then all statutory responsibility remains with the board of trustees.
Thank you, Sarah. And Stephen, from I suppose a practical perspective, in terms of taking in a converter or a sponsored school, the legal or possibly HR implications and processes that colleagues should think about.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable to say it's a bit of a nuisance, which is what I think the report probably said that you quoted. But I mean, there's a little chicken and egg here. Certainly you want to have enough capacity. That's probably easier when you're a bit bigger. So, you know, our HR manager would lead on that. The finance director would liaise appropriately. The facilities manager would be involved with due diligence, and education director and others would look at educational side of things. And I think we'd have a way of going through that. It's similar, I think, to the sort of thing that Phil was reflecting on in terms of due diligence, and then all the follow-up with a new funding agreement, etc. Engagement with your solicitors. So there's plenty to do. And it's an interesting chicken and egg pot about growth. You know, you need some capacity in order to grow, but it's easier to have that capacity when you're a bit larger. And navigating to that position is a decent challenge. We would find that a lot easier now than we did previously. Is another summary way of putting it.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Phil and then Chris. How did you ensure that the board fully understood all the implications of potential growth, both positive and negative, actually?
I was very lucky insofar that I had a great chief executive who really explained to us. One of the things that we were faced with is, having changed our board away from local governors to business people, we had very little educational knowledge on the board initially. And as I'm sure everybody in this will attest, the learning cliff for education is quite significant. So we literally had to have things spoon-fed for us for a little while. You know, there's a different language. You know, the funding behind things is not the same as business. So it really was a case of progressive board meetings. We ensured that everyone had full understanding. It was down to my predecessor as chair initially, and then down to me to ensure that people understand what's going on. And that's about asking questions. Do you understand? What do you believe you understand about this? Yeah, is what we believe what we should believe in, chief executive. So it really was a iterative process initially to understand and get the chief executive to explain, if we didn't understand, exactly what we needed to know. And only at that stage did we say, okay, now it's time to take a vote.
Okay, I've just got a question which I'll throw in the mix, Phil, about how you recruited your trustees. Where did you get them from?
Initially, we went to Academy Ambassadors. Of course, that's what I was recruited. As your board grows, guess what? We tend to draw on the friends list of our current trustees. You know, we have a role that's coming up. Does anybody have somebody that they could nominate? You know, we put them through a fairly rigorous recruitment process. We don't just accept it. But yeah, at least 3 of the trustees sitting on the board at the moment have worked with me in the past. I guess you could say that's a little bit of nepotism, but it works because I trusted these people. I knew what they could do. I knew their skills. I knew that when they joined the board, they would join the board. They could hit the ground running very, very quickly, and we wouldn't have to spend as much time as sometimes we do have to do to convert people into the educational way of thinking. So it does work. So Academy Ambassadors, let the Academy Ambassadors know exactly what you need, what skills you need. If they've got them, they will nominate them. But mine your contacts list. It's as simple as that.
Thank you. And just for clarification, colleagues, Academy Ambassadors Programme is a New Schools Network programme funded by the department as a free service to any trust. I'm one of the advisors on the programme, and we bring in business leaders as trustees to trust boards in England and working with the Regional Schools Commissioner. So if you want any further information, we can include that on the mail out. Chris, I'll come back to you on that one in terms of ensuring that the board understood, as directors of the trust, what they were taking on when they were considering growth.
Right. Well, we went about this a slightly different way. My personal opinion was that the board of the Single Academy Trust was not going to be able to be the board of a multi-academy trust. I did the skill sets grid and worked out what we would want, compared it to what we had, and decided it wasn't going to work. So I really explained to the then board that they would be, if you like, a disbanding, and a new board would take over once we had approval from the department for the MAT. So in fact, the only person sitting on the new board that was on the old one is me. Was no one else at all. So we really went by just a skill set and went about finding the people that we wanted to be on the board. That was a lot of hard work, but I won't have to do the same thing again. I might need to tinker around the edges if we took another school. or when the free school starts needing representation. But we thought let's start as we mean to go on and accept and understand that we're going to need our skill sets of people and people that have operated at a reasonably high level before to give us the abilities and the knowledge that we need. So that was hard work actually, but I'm glad we did it.
Thank you very much. Sarah, if I can come to you about your scheme of delegation and how it changed, or did it change as the trust grew?
The scheme of delegation didn't change that much as the trust grew, because we started with a CFO and a principal, myself, who became CEO, until we then, when we actually reached 3, we had to be much more careful with how we delegated in terms of the finance. So each of the principals had their own budgetary control, and they were able to have that budgetary control, and that made a very big difference once they'd got that. And I think in terms of the governance, our governors changed as the trust grew, by natural coming and natural going, and we had a very strong chair who was able to lead well and bring in new staff and new governors and make sure that they were understood the ethos. I think just popping back to what Phil said, really rigorously being able to assess new trustees before they come on board is really, really important. We very closely nearly got our fingers burnt once, and that taught us a very good lesson to be able to rigorously interview and make sure that they were going to be a good fit. Even though they might have the skills on paper, that still doesn't mean to say that a new trustee would have a good fit.
Right, I'm having some fantastic questions in the chat, which we'll pick up at 1 o'clock, but I'll just go to one of them now, possibly to Phil. How do you ensure diversity on the board?
Really interesting question, and one which I do have to say I find difficult. South Pennine Academy works in difficult areas: Oldham, Kirklees, Caldervale. We have very high percentages of East and West Asian children in our schools, and we do find it incredibly difficult to recruit to our local boards or even to our main board people of that heritage. We also have not been able to balance male and female. Of my 9 trustees at the moment, only 3 are female. When it comes right down to it, we are slaves of who applies. And I had this conversation with Anne's equivalent Scott in my area about, we would like this. And he said, Phil said, we are at the mercy of people who apply to Academy ambassadors, who are available. So we do, we are male and stale, whether we like it or not, because these are the people who are applying. There are people quite often in senior roles towards the end of their working lives, wanting to get something back. And this is the pond that we're fishing in. So it's difficult. The question is a great question. It is a question which is asked by my members. How are we doing it? And we do our best is the only answer I can give, to try to recruit people who reflect our communities. But we can only work with the people who apply for the role. And if they don't apply, yes, we have done some positive discrimination, gone out to ask people, but it's not always worked. Back to what Sarah said, sometimes what looks like a good fit culturally has not been a good fit in the business world. So we have to be careful. And as chair of the board, I don't want to get my fingers burnt.
Stephen, any reflections on that and the makeup of your board?
Yeah, I mean, it's an important, significant question, and I think everyone, as in other areas of the education system and indeed society, would say, we've got a good challenge on. We've got to take the challenge. The one thing I think I would reflect on that's been a development that we now have is that we would now always openly advertise if we sought to have a new position on the board, and advertising whatever appropriate local means. Obviously, we've got our schools, but other contacts through which we can advertise. And we've done that fairly recently, and then the members obviously are responsible for looking at applications, interviewing and making decisions. And there were 3 plausible applicants came through. 2 were pre-existing people from local governing bodies within our schools, and 1 was a student at Cambridge University, which was really interesting. And actually the members decided they wanted to co-opt him on, not make a full trustee, but he had a very interesting perspective and incredibly thoughtful. We wouldn't have got that without advertising as widely locally as possible. We did look at academy ambassadors, and that particular time we got no one through there. So it's not guaranteed that you're going to get something. Clearly, I'm well aware that it is a good source. So we would now always advertise, even I think if we had someone in mind, because why not? What have you got to lose? That person would still apply, but that would test them out through the appropriate process that the members of the board will oversee.
Thank you. We talked a little bit about finance earlier on. I'm just interested in how, as you grow, you make absolutely sure that your finances are fully compliant and that you never end up with an FNTI. And I'm just interested in the various sizes of trusts and how you scale it out. Can I start with you, Chris, on that, how you move to ensuring full accountability and oversight?
Yes, certainly. Well, we decided straight away that, well, one has to have a chief financial officer, but it doesn't define what that person may be. Myself as a chair of trustees and my lack of financial knowledge, I decided that I would definitely want the chief financial officer to be a chartered accountant, rather than a quote marks business manager, which is more or less my background anyway. But so we decided we'd have to have that, and that person would obviously be in charge of the finance of all the schools that were within the trust, i.e. local people would be reporting into her. We also decided that if possible, because as people have been pointing out, getting trustees is not something you could just dial up. You do have to look around, and it's not always easy. That we would like to have an accountant as a trustee as well, which fortunately I think we've just about got one, which happened a couple of days ago, so that we've got one accountant to quiz the second accountant, that's actually the professional person, obviously the finance and audit committee, also to quiz people there. So it's really not much different to it was as a single academy trust, quite honestly. It's just basically there's more noughts on the ends of the figures, and you break them down to 2 schools and then put them into an overall box. I think you just have to take finance so seriously, because if you love education and you have things you want to do, firstly, you must not break the law, and secondly, you mustn't go broke. And as a trustee, what's happening to the money is as important to me as what's happening to the finance. To the children, because it's the money that allows all the good ideas to be paid for and happen. And I think the more people, including chairs of local governing bodies, you can get looking at finance and making it a challenge for people to find out how better to spend money, to save money, to spend it where we'd like it to be. Let's make the money interesting and tie it in to what we can give to the children and what we can spend on teaching and learning. It shouldn't be dry. It should be quite interesting.
Thank you, Chris. Phil, in terms of the Board of Trustees all being responsible for public money, not just the accountants on the board, how do you ensure that happens and people understand the finance?
It, of course, has to be a standing agenda item for every board meeting, but we do have a Finance and Resources Committee, which is headed by one of my trustees, who is also a chartered accountant. Our CFO sits on there as not a voting member, but as an advisor to it. I'm lucky that I'm an accountant from way back in my past. I also have 2 chartered accountants sitting on my board of members. So we have quite a significant input from financially qualified people into what we do. We have very stringent financial procedures. As we grew, we realized that every school had its own set of spreadsheets, and it proved very, very difficult to control through that. So we have recently invested in an all-over accounting system, which we're currently rolling out. That will become the de facto system that every time and somebody joins us, we don't care what you had in the past, you will take our new system. So there, of course, there's an oversight, training, control thing there, but we have ensured that we have quite a number of financially qualified people sitting on our board who can oversee, they can advise, they bring in lots of experience from lots of different industries. And rapidly touching wood here, with the exception of one converter that came across with no money whatsoever, we have done all right, and we are in a financially good situation. That particular school, that particular academy, we having to do quite a lot of work. The main reason it was in a negative budgeted situation is they have too many staff. And we're currently working through that to make sure that we have the right number of staff without impacting too badly on the quality of education for the children.
Thanks, Phil. Stephen, just in terms of being an accounting officer, how are you reporting up and making sure that things like curriculum-led financial planning are having the impact on pupil outcomes?
Yeah, I mean, I think from everyone's point of view, maybe especially from where I would sit in that, do have a great finance director, won't you? You know, so that sounds a trite point, but I think it's entirely true, because a really good finance director will lead on that, keep on the ball, work with and report to in appropriate way, and as already been said, have a really good finance committee as well, and obviously then keep everyone else involved. So in terms of curriculum financial planning, our finance director would work through that with head and relevant others in each of our schools and see that as a regular thing to be done, because to some extent you could just do that yourself, but there's an education point as well for our key school leaders that they need to understand that and be thinking about that and be mindful of that as they're planning on moving forward. And the more that they are, the sounder your overall financial position, not just because you're exercising control, but because those that are making some of the key recruitment and planning decisions are cognizant of that as well. So a really good finance director working with key stakeholders, particularly school leaders, would be central from my point of view.
Thank you. And Sarah?
Yes, I think that it's essential that your finance director has the same financial vision as you do, so that you're actually running along parallel paths. And that sort of ethos, in my case, a sort of a puritanical background, which we both have, so therefore waste not, want not, has actually had us in good stead. We also have given out budgets to all the teachers, whatever their level, whether it's primary or curriculum leaders in the subject leaders in the secondary, subject directors, so that there is a sort of empowerment of all staff to take control of some finance, no matter how small. And that has helped enormously in setting budgets. And the other point on finance I'd like to make is that we made sure that we have internal auditors and external auditors, and they are from different accountants, so that we have that complete clarity of all our finance. And the internal auditors will go in depth over 9 areas over a 3-year period, so that we know that every area has been looked at in depth, and then the external auditors come in and do their normal thing. And that's been very helpful in giving security to both myself as CEO, but also our board.
Thank you, Sarah. And Chris, just looking at the existing school, bringing in the finance of a new school, and sometimes the unknowns of a new free school, any words of advice on in terms of finance and financial considerations for colleagues?
I would certainly echo something Phil said when he was there talking a moment ago. And fortunately, we've done it already. There's only 2 of us, of having a single reporting stream across the trust, so that anyone, whether they're a professional or whether they're a member of the board of trustees, can compare the different schools by looking at similar documents, so that you're looking at like for like all the time. I think that's vastly important. And the other expression, I think it was Stephen that said, do have a good finance director, won't you? So I think you need to have to know what's going on, and you have to have a reporting system that's easy for everyone to read, and you're comparing like for like on.
Thank you very much. I just want to touch on growing the central team, and any advice on that. So if I can come to Stephen about how you determine the size of the team and what has had the most impact, what are the most essential people on that team?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really fundamental question, particularly when reflecting on growth. And I think I talked about a little bit of chicken and egg before as well, that you probably need to grow the team in order to grow, but you can't do that very easily until you have grown. So working out ways of doing that, I've had an involvement with a trust, maybe it was similar to Phil's, where I was parachuted into a trust that had decided to grow like mad its central team because it knew it would get major growth over the next couple of years, but it didn't. And it was horrendously bust and had to be sorted out and closed down, for example. So there's a mistake that could be made. But on the other hand, just taking on more and stretching yourself more is no way forward either. So, you know, reflecting on and balancing that and having, but if you've got decent reserves, that sure does help in all of that. The other obvious point, which I think links to your other question, is, and that's why some sort of seed funding grants, as are available in various ways from the department, do make a lot of sense, because they can allow you to get a little bit ahead of yourself and set up for growth. For us, the most strategic development is accident of history. We started out as a secondary trust, initially from one school, and a couple of other secondaries joined, but we always had a view about primary. We used a grant that we got for growth to employ someone who we call our primary executive leader, who'd been ahead and done very well in 2 primary schools, and he led that. Even though there was only 1 primary at the time, we now have 7 primaries. I don't think we would have made that jump without being able to employ him and his role and remit, but a grant enabled us to do that before the schools had joined. So that's perhaps an interesting example.
Could you expand for colleagues a little bit about that, Stephen, about how you get the grants, how you apply for them, how you know about them, and how you're successful in obtaining them?
Yeah, they keep popping up from time to time, I think it is the answer, and they keep having slightly different iterations of what they're called. They're overseen by the Regional School Commissioner's Office. So I suppose I would be saying that, you know, whether you like it or not, being in communication with the Regional School Commissioner's Office, and you probably should have a named contact there. Certainly that's how ours work, making it very clear we are interested in growing. You're going to have to come to them anyway. They should also flag with you as and when the next grant might come up. It'll be published on the gov.uk website in the education section, but being proactively engaged with the Regional School Commissioner's Office, and also them letting you know that an appropriate grant could be on the way, and that might be relevant for the developments and growth plans being talked about. That's what I would suggest. And I'd even lost the plot on what is or isn't available right now. I don't know the answer to that. It's not particularly relevant in our situation right now, but I'd hope it would be in the relatively near future.
Thank you, that's really helpful. Sarah, in terms of your central team, your strategic plan for that team, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, I would just pick up on what Stephen said about the grant. We made an error in that we didn't get sponsorship confirmation that we could be a sponsor, because when you start a free school and then another free school and then another free school, you don't have to be an acknowledged sponsor. But we had to get sponsorship approval. And we had been awarded a grant, but we couldn't make use of it because we hadn't got sponsorship approval. And then we lost the grant because there's always a deadline. So make sure that you've got sponsorship approval if you're wanting to grow as a trust before you apply for the grant. Otherwise, that time and energy is wasted. So that was just one thing that I wanted to mention on that, because you can learn from our mistakes on that one. I think my one key bit of advice would be recognise fairly early on, if you're a growing trust as a CEO, that you can't have your finger in every pie. it's very difficult because you go from that transition to being everywhere and in everything and knowing everything to actually employing really good people who you can surround yourself with and being oversight of the whole trust. And the important thing that I would pass on is make sure that you appoint just ahead of need and not just after the point at which you're needing, because otherwise you're screaming for help and you don't have it. And we've learnt, again, the hard way that actually to appoint ahead of need has been really, really useful.
Thank you, Sarah. And Phil, in terms of growing that central team and making sure that the board know the impact they're having, what's been your approach at South Pennines?
I think a lot depends on whether you centralise things within the team. If you are centralising everything, obviously, as you sponsor an academy or you'll convert an academy, then you start to bring people into the team. So you've got to grow organically. The one thing that we found was that because we started off as a sponsor academy, i.e. bringing in schools and academies who were in special measures or were struggling in one way, shape or form, the first two we brought across, we struggled because, exactly as Sarah said, we didn't expand the school improvement team in time. We learned from that, and now we know that we have a little bit, not a great deal, because we don't want too much fat, but we have a little bit of fat in our school improvement team, so that if we do have to put teams into another school, we can cope, and we don't struggle, and we don't have to shout for help. In terms of the board, again, it's down to the communication abilities of the chief executive and how they sell it to us, because we're not, with two exceptions who have come from an academic educational background, we're not educationalists. And we are learning as we go, but we do have to have it explained to us. So again, the chief executive's report at every board meeting is very, very comprehensive.
Great.
That is my way of trying to ensure that my trustees have a little bit of an inkling about what's going on.
Excellent. Thank you all very much. We're going to go over to Q&A session. I've got some fascinating questions that I received before the event and fabulous ones coming up in the chat. So we'll try and get to as many as possible this morning. I'll start with this one. If I can come to you, Stephen, a key concern for SATs looking at joining a larger MAT is loss of identity. What's your opinion on this?
Oh, this is interesting stuff. So my economics background comes out here. It depends. Who are you joining with? What and what are you seeking to do, and what do you mean by loss of agency? There's a lot of interrelated stuff of which I've discussed. I think some of this comes down to the notion of autonomy, and also what I would call, when I heard someone use it, the term agency. And I think in all of this, I've come to a view that it really matters that we all have agency, and definitely, in other words, we help to shape and we're part of, but maybe autonomy in itself not helpful. What do we want autonomy to do? To do whatever we fancy on our own, regardless of everyone else? Is that what we actually mean? I don't buy into that as a vision for the education system. But boy, do I want to have agency, and do I want to affect and influence? And I think even surveys of teachers have said this very clearly about what contributes to job satisfaction. And it's this notion of agency. So, might there be versions of joint thinking that mean changes of words and perhaps ways of doing it? Yeah, there might well be. That's sort of life. But what I would want is agency, and to be able to contribute and shape that. If I didn't have that in any way, I'd wonder what I was about and what I was joining. So that's what I think I would ask myself and want to be clear about. And not get hung up on the word autonomy. But anyway, that's probably after much reflection where I think I sit on this.
I think that's a fascinating reflection, and looking at the research this morning, autonomy, as you would expect, comes up a lot, and I think that advice is incredibly helpful for people having those conversations. I'm going to come to the two sales folk with the same sort of question. In your conversations with people joining Phil or considering joining the MAT, where they possibly had concern about a loss of identity. You were very clear about what your expectations of governance. So can you expand a little bit on that conversation?
Yeah. At the point, we knew we were starting to grow. As a board, we sat down and we discussed how we wanted to grow, and we looked at two extreme models. One was the outward school, that if you join the outward group, you paint everything purple, you have your brains taken out, you have an outward brain stuffed into you, and everything is a clone of everything else. We rejected that. The way we've gone down is that we believe schools are the centre of their community. And yes, we may have a name change as part of the sponsoring, but what we don't want to do is change what they have been to the community. So we don't change that from that point of view. They continue doing, but what we do have is non-negotiables and negotiables. Non-negotiables, of course, there are policies and procedures, our financial policies and procedures particularly. Everybody complies to that. If they don't want to comply to that, they don't join us. But we do give our principals quite a lot of flexibility in choice of curriculum to meet their community needs. We give them quite a lot of flexibility in the way they manage their budgets, but they still have to manage it within our policies. So that is part of this, as I'm saying, the sales thing. That no, we're not going to take away your sense of community. What we're going to do is add our experience in making schools better, add the financial stability of having a big map behind you, and having the fact that because we have policies and procedures which have been agreed, do work, have been signed off by the unions, which means that they're acceptable at all levels, we're just going to make your lives easier. But we don't take away your sense of community.
Thanks, Phil. Chris, any additional points on that question?
I think it's really very similar. We don't want schools to lose their, whichever word we're going to use, anyway, their autonomy or their independence. We have an expression called earned autonomy. We see the scheme of delegation as something that's different for different schools within the trust, depending on what stage of their journey they're in. But if you're going to school in Northampton and you go to Kingsthorpe College, as far as we're concerned, Kingsthorpe College is Kingsthorpe College. It has its board of governors, it has its head teacher, it has its uniform, and it interacts with the community. We don't stick our Orbis logo on anything at all except documents, and don't really see particularly why the parents should be, or the children should be interested that Orbis exists. We're there to operate in the background, to provide, as Phil was saying, financial security, and also that's the one thing you can't do, thou shalt not overspend. But other than that, lots of help can be given, and likewise with the school development team, that a MAT, as well as looking after the heavy lifting of the business side, should be a repository of educational knowledge, so that we've got the right person to go and help and solve and lead teams to figure out problems. But we very, very much want the schools to go on being themselves, because, I mean, Phil, you would know better than me. Now, if fast forward, we could manage with 2 or 3, but when you're talking 6, 7 or 8, how on earth could you directly manage those? You need a strong and empowered, in my view, local governing body to make sure that you've got a dynamism within the school and it's a living and exciting place to be. So I think if people are worried about losing autonomy, it's a good idea to work out what are you actually worried about losing? And if you think you're going to be told to do stuff that you really fundamentally don't want to do, that's not a problem of joining a MAT. It might be that you're looking at the wrong MAT and you need to find one that better suits your way of doing things.
Thank you, Chris. And I've got a question, Sarah. You might have a view on this, or other colleagues. Question is, we're considering joining a MAT or possibly starting our own. Do you think it's best to join with schools within the same local authority, or to look more broadly to ensure the best fit for vision and values?
I think in a way Chris has just answered that, in terms of the vision and the values are really essential in being able to have a happy partnership. I don't think necessarily being in the same local authority is the be all and end all, particularly now everybody has become so online savvy. We can have meetings like this really at the drop of a hat, which is just phenomenal. And even though our schools are 400 meters apart, they still have Teams meetings for things because it's just that much easier And I think, so I don't think a geographical barrier is at the same level as where we were even 5 years ago. I think that's not necessary to have a geographical barrier. What's important is that your ethos matches. And it's interesting listening to Chris talk. I can hear echoes of very much what we have set up. So immediately, you know, you sort of think, well, actually, there's somebody we could join with as a trust because they've got similar vision to what we have in terms of it's about the children, it's about them enjoying education, it's about educational visits, outward bound activities, and it's not all about passing exams, particularly in the primary stage. And I think that's what's important, is to find trust that's got the same vision as you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'll throw this question open to the panel and just wave at me if you have a view, rather than coming to anyone in particular. Does anyone on the panel have experience of working with a special school as part of the MAT, or perhaps have considered sponsoring a special school? Or do you have a view on whether there should be a different approach?
Thanks, Anne. A couple of quick thoughts. I mean, firstly, we don't have a special school, but I think in principle we would be very interested in the local area, insofar as it would fit in with our vision of the sort of totality of the educational community. If we were to do that, it would be a very good example again of being clear about the need to employ appropriate expert lead, and we shouldn't and wouldn't do that without making that step. The other observation is that there may be more than one way of doing things, as well as there often are. So across several of our schools now, we have enhanced resources centres for high functioning autistic youngsters who have a statement that would the HCP plus that would enable them to access beyond mainstream education, but because of this enhanced resources provision, actually they come on roll whichever of our mainstream schools. We've now got over 100. You could bundle them all up and put them separately and call it a special school, but it's a different way. It's seeking to have them in many mainstream lessons, but with considerably enhanced support. So, you know, there's more than one way of doing things. So in a sense, we have got a special school, except we haven't.
Okay, thank you. Chris, I've got a question here that I think would probably be your experience, I think would be really helpful here. We're struggling to become a MAT. As a single academy, prospective schools seem to prefer existing MATs with a track record. What can we do? We don't feel we have the capacity for sponsorship yet.
Well, yes, we have been through that, I suppose. Firstly, you need to know exactly what it is you want to do. You have to sort it out your own house and be happy with what you'd like to do. I think you need to lay your plans for the future, even if they're not actually possible to pursue just at the moment. Draw the diagram, put the boxes in, say where you'd like to be, so that when you're talking about your vision of a MAT to the chair or the board or the head teacher of other schools, you can be talking about 1 step, 2 steps, 3 steps, and let them see. I think the biggest thing you can offer a school to join you is that if they join an established MAT, they will be joining, it's exactly what it says, they will be joining an established MAT, which may or may not suit what they want to do. If they're keen on starting a MAT with you, I understand you're in the driving seat, not them, of course they will be bringing an awful lot to that MAT. They'll be part of the creation process. And certainly some schools like to join small MATs, realizing they're going to have a great deal more influence, which is true, they will have. So I think that's the way I'd say, plan forward so you can say what you would like to happen, but also let it be known that they're going to be part of it. If they have the same vision as yourself, they can help shape it and help put it together with you.
Thanks, Chris. I've had a few questions on governance, so sorry to hop around, but several which I'll roll in from colleagues. So are there ever tensions between the local governing board and the MAT board, given the local board feel very close to the community? And how do you make sure that that relationship works? Sarah, would you like to have a
Yes, I think it depends on the strategic vision that you have for that local governing board. But if they don't take statutory responsibility, then the issues from the local governing, local college councils, as we call them, or local governing boards, they're not really issues, because if there is something that is making them uncomfortable, that is what is then brought through to the board, and we have to sort that out, because that can't carry on if there is something that is not right as they perceive it, either from a community point of view, from a parent point of view, and we have been oblivious to that. Then we now need to be able to address that. I think what it does bring, though, is a greater closeness to the principal within the community representatives, within the parent and the parent representatives. And it's very much a PR vehicle for the school within the community.
Thank you. Another question here. Can you grow or develop your existing finance business manager, or do you feel that you should recruit an external CFO? Stephen.
Yeah, I think particularly we're talking finance director here, aren't we? And I mean, sorry to dodge it slightly, it depends. If you've got someone great who clearly can step up and take that wider role across schools as well as being done, then that is plausible, and that is somewhat where we started, although not quite, but it's from fairly early in our journey that someone did that. You've got to make a good judgment on that. It may be that you do have to recruit externally. So I guess with any appointment of substance like that both are possible, but if appointing and growing internally, you've got to be sure and confident that they've got the necessary understanding and skills which would go beyond those within one school to be able to take that on. And if that isn't the case, you must recruit externally, would be my view. So it depends is an answer I've probably used before. But
That's fine. I know Phil and Chris have spoken about this earlier. Sarah, do you have a view on that as a growing trust?
Well, I think all of the panel here would say they themselves have grown in their careers, and there's an opportunity for that person to grow in their own abilities, providing you put in the right professional development. And we've seen a high number of employees, including the chief finance officer, go from quite a low start in terms of ability to being extraordinary people and very, very capable. But I think as CEO and then as a trust, one has to have one's antennae out to when people have reached their full capacity. And then that's quite difficult. If you then, you have to be very shrewd with the way that you manage that person into a different role that they want to do, and then you bring in the person that you really want. And I think that's the key to being a good CEO in terms of being able to ensure the best from everybody.
Thanks, Sarah. Now this is a really interesting one, I think, for all of you. So I'll come to Chris first and then work my way around the room. How can we effectively market our trust to other local schools when we're a small trust at the beginning of our growth journey?
Well, I suppose I'm in that position, really. I'm quite happy to send emails and write letters to chairs of other schools saying, do you fancy a cup of coffee and an informal chat? We may as well get to know each other, which I think has value anyway. Regardless, you may as well know who's down the road. Sometimes help each other, even getting governors, trustees, or what have you. So yeah, be proactive. Go out and make friends with your opposite number. Your head teacher's probably already doing that with the local head teachers. I'd be quite surprised if not. So really start doing the same thing at a governance level and making friends with other people on boards of governors. And then, of course, we are, in a modern social media age. LinkedIn, which I think has facilitated this group of people being together, is available there. Twitter is also available, and I think to have an active social media presence, bringing your trust quote school forward, particularly Twitter and LinkedIn, to other professionals is probably worth doing as well. It certainly costs nothing except a little bit of time and energy.
Thanks, Chris. Stephen, any view on that marketing and messaging?
Yes, I can see it somewhat depends on exactly your context and quite how small or a bit beyond small you might be. I think the one thing I would reflect on, and particularly with the growth of our primaries, is use what you've got. And for me, the most obvious thing there, I think Chris alluded to, is your primary heads. So I would at a very early stage say, look, you probably know what I'm going to say. Why don't you visit one or two of the heads who you know, and I won't be there, and I've not. And actually, that's probably been, at the very minimum, deeply reassuring to schools that might be interested, and that whoever makes decisions here, obviously the head teacher is at least one of the very fundamentals. If the head is keen, you've got a decent chance of proceeding forward. If they're clearly not, well, that's not going to be straightforward. So heads in our schools, particularly with our primary growth, have probably been, I think, the most instrumental locally.
Thank you. Sarah?
Yes, I would agree with Steve. Got to be head to head or chair to chair. I think both those avenues are very, very valid and very important, because schools won't naturally gravitate towards you if they're a little bit anxious. You've got to make the way, make the path clear, bend over backwards to offer them things that they want.
And Phil, any differences at your trust in the approach to marketing?
I think our marketing almost came by accident, and it was down to the relationship between our chief executive and the regional schools commissioner. They had worked together in the past, they knew each other, so the RSC knew that our chief executive was a good person. So a lot of stuff was put our way. A lot of the sponsored academies were literally, we were asked, do you want them? After we had successfully worked with some of these sponsored academies for a while, we gained a reputation. Then people started to come to us. However, one of my trustees was, until very recently, the marketing director for Mars UK. And echoing what Chris just said, the work he has done with our schools in improving our social media marketing is tremendous.
Thank you. And we'll just have time for one last question. Do any of you, and I think I'll come back around the other way. I'll start with Phil and go back around. Do any of you have experience of the DFE's try before you buy trust partnership model? Or do you have a view of how helpful that would be for colleagues? Sarah, you were straight in there, so I will come to you and then go back to Phil.
Well, we had experience of try before you buy. So we were approached by the department to take on a secondary school. And we said, yes, we would do that, providing we could try before we buy for a year, because we felt that would be the responsible way forward. This school is a failing school and has been so all the way along and is in a very tricky situation. And you have, if you're a fairly small trust of 3 schools as we are, you've got responsibility to those parents, staff and the trustees that you're not going to leap into something that you can't manage. And that was immediately rejected by the DFE. They wanted to palm the school off very quickly onto another trust. So that's been my experience.
Okay, Phil, any experience or a view of how helpful it would be?
I don't think we've done it formally. However, 2 of our converters worked with us some considerable time before they actually came across full time. We did have a secondary that it proved to be try before you buy, because it took 18 months to complete the paperwork to transfer the school from the local authority. So to all intents and purposes, we were running the school, we had imposed our policies, procedures, we had started to take out staff, put in new staff, all without any real formal remit to do so, because they didn't actually belong to us. So I guess that's the nearest to try before you buy. It was successful. from that point of view. But no, it's not being done formally.
Do you want to just highlight the key advantages of that lead-in time?
It gave us some considerable time to truly understand the staff. It was a school in special measures, as it turned out. Because it was in special measures, it attracted poor teachers. Because it attracted poor teachers, it never got out of special measures. So that 12 months truly allowed us to understand from a school improvement point of view, what do we need to do? When it became ours, how could we convert it? How could we convince parents and carers to send their children to what had been for several years a dump school in the area? It's taken a while. That 12 months helped us to really understand the school. We are slowly turning it around. It's not perfect. It won't ever be perfect, but we're doing the best, and it helped. Yeah.
Thank you, Stephen.
Yes, this is rather a good pertinent question for us. So, no, we don't use the word, the phrase "try before you buy," which could be deemed slightly unfortunate and not as attractive as it could be. So, but we have developed and have now live as of September what we call associate membership. And we have our first full-blown associate member as of September. You might not be surprised to know that they're a church school. Because of course there's an interesting category about what do we do in our local area when all of us will have church schools, but of course depending on the views and the way of operating the local diocese, they may or may not be able to join your trust, or even if they did, that could be an intriguing process. So we've drawn up what is in effect a service level agreement which utterly mimics, all bar the ultimate responsibility, which still sits with the governance of that school, the being in the trust. And we operate via a simple standard top slice of the core funding, same access to all educational and ancillary services. I happened to have a review this morning with the chair of governors and the head, and incredibly positive feedback. So we will reflect on that. We've got a lot of primary church schools in the areas we operate on. It may be an interesting way forward. The only thing is, if we label it as try before you buy to the church, I think I know what their response might be. So we call it associate membership.
Really, really interesting. Thanks, Stephen. Chris?
Well, yeah, I was just listening to what Steve had to say, and I found that very interesting as well. No, we haven't done it formally. Like Phil, we've done it informally. We were always an outward-looking school as a single academy trust. Our head teacher mentored the newly appointed head teacher of a school, bigger school than us, in fact, and we swapped and mixed and matched department heads with them. They're settled now, and she's mentoring another local head teacher. I found senior teaching staff love going and helping out in their departments. If you're a physicist, you want to go and help with the physics. So I suppose I look upon that as collaboration, and I'm very into collaboration. I think it will always benefit, but you must realize it's not a complete mat. And if collaboration starts involving spending money, you need to be very careful, because someone can suddenly decide to stop playing once the spending has started. So I think as you've got a definite, or service level agreement, as you called it, Stephen, if there's a definite expectation of what's going to happen, then I think it's an interesting path to go down. Yeah.
Yeah, really helpful. Thank you. So lastly, before I hand back to Tim, if you knew now what you knew then, or if you knew then what you know now, what would be your killer piece of advice to colleagues on the call? Stephen, pearls of wisdom.
Sorry. Yeah, okay. I'll pick one overarching theme, which I think, whether I speak personally, I hope I speak on behalf of our trust, really seek to be as clear as you can be about what it is that you are really all about, and keep reminding yourself of that as a guide. But then within that, do be flexible depending on circumstances to how exactly you therefore can and do choose to move forward.
Thank you. Sarah?
Stick to your vision, but have the humility to change as the world changes.
Thank you very much. Phil?
Vision, of course, is a big part of it, but for me, a lot of my success came when I got my trustees to realise why they were doing it. They weren't sitting in an ivory tower as a board making decisions about just money. It really came to fruition when we introduced what we call a linked trustees role, so that every trustee was linked to an academy and they spend time in that academy. They get to know the teaching staff, the principal, they get to know the children. They sit and read with the children in the primary schools. They attend performances. They go to the local advisory board meetings. And it really started to bring it home to my trustees that it's all about children. Not finance, not marketing, it's about children. And from that point onwards, I got real buy-in for what we were trying to do.
Thank you, Phil. And last but by no means least, Chris.
I would say I don't know all that much now. So what would I change? We've only just started doing this. I certainly wouldn't like to start from the beginning again. I'm much happier to be now saying I do have an established MAT and we are able to assimilate people into it in many different ways. Everyone that's mentioned vision, I come back to endlessly with my new trustees. Remember whom I don't know. I interviewed these people. We had a semi-informal session to look at the vision and strategy documents for both schools and to produce a one-page strategy document and vision that encompassed what the MAT wants to do and how it wants to do it, behind which the executive function can, of course, pile all sorts of amounts of paper and indeed should do. So I think having the vision and knowing what you want to do is probably the most important thing. The last thing you want is confusion in your organisation and in your thinking.
Lovely. Thank you all so much. Tim, can I hand back to you, please?
Yes, thank you so much. That was such an informative session. So thank you all, and that will wrap up the panel discussion. Thank you very much to Anne, Sarah, Phil, Stephen, and Chris. As I say, that was really informative. I hope that the attendees found that just as informative as I did. So that's the end of the panel discussion. If you have any further questions for the panel, please do feel free to reach out to NSN, and I'm sure that the panel will happily sort of allow us to send some questions to them if you have any follow-up. As Anne mentioned as well, Academy ambassadors have lots of great support in terms of trustee recruitment, so please do contact them as well if that's of interest to you. And New Schools Network also supports chairs intensively of small and single Academy trusts through our dedicated team of advisors, as well as a service called NSN Chairs Connect, where you can speak one-on-one to one of our specialists around your trust growth plans. We're going to shortly have an opportunity to network with other attendees if you'd like to, but before this, we're just going to pop up a feedback poll on your screen. It'd be really useful and really beneficial to us if you just really kindly fill that out quickly if you're an attendee of the session. And so I'll just give you a short moment just to click there on your screen. If you just click on what relates to how you found the session and also what your trust is, that would be absolutely perfect. And thank you, Sarah, for sharing your contact details there in the chat as well. So just fill out this quick feedback poll. What we're going to do is we're going to move on to a networking session. It's entirely optional. So if you do want to leave us now, please do so by just leaving the call after you've put in your feedback. I hope you have a lovely day and thank you for attending. If anyone is interested in continuing on and networking with other leaders of small single academy trusts, then please do just stay on the call, and we're going to pop you into either networking groups or as a group to essentially just get to know each other. And it's going to be very unmoderated. It's for you to network and share ideas around trust growth with other people who might be in similar positions. Once again, thank you very much to the panel and the speakers today through their discussions. And similarly, if you are keen to nip off as well, then thank you so much, and I hope that you also have a lovely day.